My heart was racing as I walked down the stairs of our house, trying not to make a sound. Jake, my husband's son, was in the kitchen. The tension between us had been growing for weeks, but I never imagined it would reach this point. Every glance exchanged, every accidental touch seemed to carry a deeper, more forbidden meaning. That silent night, I found Jake in the kitchen. He had his back turned, fiddling with something on the counter. "Hi, Jake," I said, trying to sound casual. He turned around slowly, and the look in his eyes made me freeze. It was intense, burning. "Emily," he replied, his voice charged with an emotion I couldn't decipher. We held each other's gaze for what seemed like an eternity. I took a step forward, and he did the same. The next thing I knew, we were incredibly close. I felt the warmth of his body, the smell of his skin. It was then that our fingers touched, accidentally. But it was like an electric shock that ran through my body. How did we get to this point? I thought, but I couldn't pull my hand away. Jake didn't move either. He just looked at me, and in that instant, I knew that everything was about to change. A few days later, Jake invited me to his apartment. I hesitated. I was married to Peter, his father, and I knew it was wrong. But the temptation was too strong. When I arrived, Jake was waiting for me. The warmth of his touch made me forget everything, and the kiss he gave me sealed the betrayal. Guilt mixed with pleasure as we spent the night together. The next morning, I woke up next to Jake. Regret and desire mixed in my chest. At family gatherings, our silent conversations and complicit glances increased the sexual tension between us. Every text message exchanged in secret was a reminder of what we had done and what we still wanted to do. I tried to keep things normal at home with Peter, making excuses to meet Jake. Guilt consumed me as I looked Peter in the eye. At the same time, fantasies about Jake kept me awake at night. I was living a double life, and the line between desire and betrayal was becoming increasingly blurred. Chapter 2. The intensification of the affair. The first weekend I spent with Jake was a watershed. He had planned everything meticulously. He said we needed to get out of the city, go somewhere where no one knew us, where we could be ourselves, without the constant shadow of my marriage to Peter. At first, I hesitated. The thought of lying to Peter about a business trip was eating me up inside, but the desire to be with Jake was stronger. When we finally arrived at the hotel, I felt a mixture of adrenaline and fear. The room was luxurious, with a huge bed that seemed to invite doom. Jake pulled me close to him, and before I could process any thoughts, our lips met in a searing kiss. The passion we felt there was indescribable, as if the outside world had ceased to exist. "Emily, you look beautiful," Jake murmured as his hands explored my body. "I can't live without you anymore." "Jake, what are we doing?" I asked, still fighting the guilt. "We're living, Emily. We're allowing ourselves to feel." That night was an explosion of feelings. I gave myself completely to him, forgetting for a moment all the consequences. The pleasure I felt was overwhelming, and the guilt that had consumed me before seemed to disappear in the midst of that unbridled passion. When I returned home, reality hit me like a punch in the stomach. Pretending to be normal with Peter was exhausting. He began to notice changes in my behavior, and his suspicions began to grow. "Emily, you look strange. Is everything all right?" Peter asked, concerned. "Yes, I'm just tired from the trip," I replied, avoiding his eyes. Jake didn't make things easy. He wanted to see me more and more, and I made up excuses to be with him. I felt an internal conflict between desire and guilt, but I couldn't stop. Each encounter with Jake was a more daring sexual adventure than the last. We met in public places, always with the fear of being discovered, which only added to the excitement. "Emily, you're everything I've ever wanted," Jake whispered in my ear as we hid in a dark corner of a bar. The feeling of living a double life was exciting and dangerous. At the same time, the frustration of not being able to stop consumed me. I was constantly lying to Peter, and each lie made me feel like I was betraying not only him, but myself. "Jake, I don't know what to do," I confessed in one of those furtive encounters. "I'm lost between you and Peter. Emily, I need you. I can't lose you," Jake replied, his eyes full of desire and determination. The fear of being discovered was constant. Every time Peter looked me in the eye, I felt as if he could see right through me, as if he knew all my secrets. At the same time, the passion I felt for Jake kept me awake at night, fantasizing about our encounters. "Emily, I love you," Peter said one night, holding my hand. "I feel something is wrong. Please be honest with me." Those words hit me like a knife. The guilt was unbearable, but I still couldn't tear myself away from Jake. The double life I was leading was an emotional roller coaster, and I was trapped in a vicious cycle, not knowing how to get out. With each passing day, the pressure increased. Jake wanted more from me, and I was torn between my desire for him and my love for Peter. I felt like I was at a crossroads, but I didn't know which way to go. "Emily, I'm not going to give up on you," Jake said, with a firmness that scared and excited me at the same time. I knew I was playing with fire, but the feeling of freedom and adrenaline was addictive. I was living a life I'd never imagined, full of pleasure and danger, and I didn't know how to stop. The tension between Jake and me had always been palpable. From the moment Peter and I got married, I felt that Jake looked at me in a different way. It wasn't hostility, but something deeper, something I couldn't decipher. Every time we were in the same environment, the energy seemed to change, and I didn't know how to deal with it. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but every day, the tension seemed to grow. One silent night, I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. Everything was dark and quiet. When I turned on the light, there was Jake, leaning against the worktop, with an expression that was a mixture of surprise and something else. He was drinking a glass of milk, and our gazes met in a way that sent a chill down my spine. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you," he said with a smile. "It's okay," I replied, trying to sound casual, but my heart was racing. As I walked past him to get a glass, our hands accidentally touched. It was a quick touch, but the intensity of that moment was overwhelming. I looked at him, and he held my gaze for a second longer than usual. "Emily, how did we get to this point?" he whispered, his voice laden with emotion that I couldn't identify. That night was the beginning of the end. Jake's invitation for a chance meeting at his apartment came soon after. He claimed he needed help with something in the apartment, and I hesitantly accepted. I remembered my marriage to Peter every minute, but curiosity and attraction were stronger. When I got there, the tension between us was palpable. We talked for a while, but it wasn't long before he approached and touched my face. The warmth of his touch was irresistible, and when our lips met, I knew I was sealing a betrayal. I spent the night with Jake, and a mixture of guilt and pleasure consumed me. I woke up next to him, feeling a deep regret, but also an insatiable desire. During family gatherings, our conversations were silent, and our gazes were complicit. The sexual tension grew with each furtive encounter, and the text messages we exchanged in secret were increasingly ardent. Trying to maintain normality at home with Peter was a Herculean task. I made up excuses to meet Jake, and guilt consumed me every time I looked into Peter's eyes. Even so, the fantasies about Jake were so intense that they kept me awake at night. Jake planned a weekend away from the city, and I lied to Peter, saying it was a business trip. In the hotel room, unbridled passion enveloped us, and the feeling of freedom and the adrenaline rush of risk was intoxicating. But on returning to reality, pretending to be normal at home became even more difficult. Peter became suspicious of my behavior, and Jake's pressure for more dates only increased. I struggled internally between desire and guilt. Our sexual encounters became more and more daring. We risked encounters in public places, and the fear of being discovered was exciting. I discovered new pleasures and repressed desires, and the double life I was leading became increasingly exciting and dangerous. But the frustration of realizing I couldn't stop was overwhelming. The constant lies to Peter made me feel like a traitor, and I no longer knew how I felt about Jake and Peter. The fear of being found out tormented me every day. Jake gave me an ultimatum, demanding that I choose between him and Peter. Indecision consumed me, and the fear of losing everything paralyzed me. The arguments with Jake were heated, but our encounters remained passionate. I decided to continue with Jake, even though I knew the risks. We planned one last date before deciding our future. The tension and passion during the secret meeting were overwhelming. We whispered promises and kissed ardently, but I sensed that something was about to change. Peter became increasingly suspicious of my behavior. He noticed the signs and became suspicious. His silent investigation led to Jake, and the tension at home was growing. I feared being discovered at every turn. The day of confrontation arrived. Peter confronted me about his suspicions, and my reaction was denial. But the truth was revealed, and an explosion of emotions swept over us. Jake, realizing that everything was about to collapse, was in shock. I was forced to choose between Jake and Peter. The internal struggle and anguish of losing one of the two consumed me. Intense conversations with both of them left me even more confused. I felt trapped in a situation with no way out. At our last meeting with Jake, passion and sadness mixed in our last kiss. He promised to wait for me, and the goodbye was painful. I knew that I would lose something precious, regardless of the choice. I confronted Peter with the truth. His reaction was a storm of emotions. I tried to save our marriage, but the decision to forgive or not was up to him. Life after the truth was revealed was difficult. The consequences of my actions haunted me, and I reflected on my choices. My relationship with Jake and Peter was uncertain, and doubt about the future constantly haunted me. When it all began, I couldn't have imagined that my life would take such an unexpected turn. Jake, my husband Peter's son, had always been a constant presence in our home. At first, our relationship was friendly, cordial, but over time, a growing tension hung in the air. It was as if something was about to happen, and I didn't know how to deal with it. One silent night, I got up to get a drink of water and found Jake in the kitchen. He was leaning against the counter with an expression I couldn't decipher. When our gazes met, I felt a chill. It was an intense look, a moment when time seemed to stop. As I passed him, our hands accidentally touched. That touch, so brief, triggered a series of events that would change everything. How did we get to this point? I asked myself over and over again as I tried to sleep that night. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and feelings. A few days later, Jake invited me to his apartment for a chance meeting. I hesitated. The image of Peter, my husband, appeared in my mind, reminding me of the commitment we had. But the temptation was too strong. I ended up accepting. When I arrived at Jake's apartment, he welcomed me with a smile that was a mixture of desire and complicity. We talked for a while, but soon the warmth of his touch enveloped me, and before I knew it, we were kissing. The betrayal had been sealed. That first night, guilt mixed with pleasure as we spent hours together. When I woke up next to Jake the next morning, a mixture of regret and desire washed over me. I knew I was on a dangerous path, but I couldn't stay away. In the days that followed, Our silent conversations and complicit glances during family gatherings only increased the sexual tension between us. We exchanged passionate text messages in secret, feeding a desire that seemed impossible to control. I tried to keep things normal at home with Peter, making excuses to meet up with Jake. But every time I looked Peter in the eye, guilt consumed me. At the same time, fantasies about Jake kept me awake at night, making it impossible to resist. Jake and I planned a weekend together, away from the city. I lied to Peter, saying I had a business trip. The unbridled passion we felt in the hotel room was overwhelming. I felt a sense of freedom and the adrenaline rush of the risk of being discovered. When I returned home, pretending to be normal was an arduous task. Peter's suspicions about my behavior began to surface, and Jake was pushing for more dates. The internal struggle between desire and guilt was eating me up inside. Our encounters became more and more daring. We explored new pleasures, met in public places, always with the fear of being discovered. Living a double life was exciting and dangerous, but also exhausting. I began to realize that I couldn't stop. The constant lies to Peter and the feeling of betrayal tortured me. My feelings for Jake and Peter were confused. The fear of being found out and the consequences of this haunted me. In a moment of desperation, Jake gave me an ultimatum: choose between him and Peter. The indecision and the fear of losing everything paralyzed me. We had heated discussions and passionate encounters, and I ended up deciding to continue with Jake, even though I knew the risks. We planned one last date before deciding our future. The tension and passion during that secret meeting was palpable. We made whispered promises between ardent kisses, but there was a feeling that something was about to change. Peter began to notice my strange behavior, and his suspicion grew. He began to investigate quietly, finding clues that led him to suspect Jake. The tension at home was unbearable, and I feared being found out. The moment of confrontation arrived. Peter asked me directly about his suspicions. I tried to deny everything, but the truth gradually came out, and an explosion of emotions overtook us. Jake, realizing that everything was about to collapse, was shocked. I was faced with an impossible choice, forced to choose between Jake and Peter. The internal struggle and the anguish of losing one of the two were unbearable. I had intense conversations with both of them, feeling trapped in a situation with no way out. On a last date with Jake, before making a decision, passion and sadness mixed in our kisses. Jake promised to wait for me, but the goodbye was painful. I felt an enormous sense of loss. Confronting Peter with the truth was one of the most difficult experiences of my life. His reaction was a storm of emotions. I tried to save our marriage, but the decision to forgive or not was in his hands. Life after the truth was revealed was uncertain. The consequences of my actions made me reflect on my choices. My relationship with Jake and Peter was shaken, and the doubt about the future and the feeling of regret were constant. I felt lost, trapped in a cycle of infidelity and guilt. The double life I was leading seemed to have no end, and the acceptance of a life of betrayal was a weight I carried every day. I thought that after everything, my life would take a different turn. But fate seemed to have other plans for me. After the explosion of emotions and the revelation of the truth to Peter, I found myself in a place I had never imagined I would be again. And then it happened. The reunion with Jake. I was in a cafe, trying to avoid any thought that would remind me of the chaos my life was in. And that's when I saw him, coming through the door, as if the universe wanted to play with me. He saw me, and our gazes met. My heart raced, and all the emotions I'd been trying to stifle came to the surface. "Emily," he said, approaching my desk, "can we talk?" I hesitated, but eventually nodded. He sat down, and we stood there in silence for a moment. The tension between us was palpable. "I've missed you," he finally said, looking into my eyes. "I can't stop thinking about you." His words moved me. I knew I should push him away, but something inside me wouldn't let me. "Jake, that's crazy," I replied, trying to be rational. "I'm still married to your father. This shouldn't be happening." "I know," he said, holding my hand, "but I can't help it. And from what I can see, neither can you." I knew he was right. Even if everything was wrong, my feelings for Jake hadn't disappeared. And so we lost ourselves in another night of passion. Each encounter was intense, as if it were the last time. And in a way, I knew it could be. Guilt consumed me every time I looked at Peter. He was trying to rebuild us, trying to forgive us. But I kept lying, meeting up with Jake on the sly. "Emily, where were you?" Peter asked one evening as I walked into the house. "You're acting strange again." I froze, trying to think of an excuse. "I was with friends. I needed to get something off my chest." He looked at me, clearly skeptical, but didn't say anything else. The guilt mixed with the adrenaline of living this double life was overwhelming. And at the same time, the passion for Jake didn't subside. "I want you now, Emily," Jake whispered on the phone one night. "Come to our place." My mind was screaming at me to say no, but my body was already moving. Every encounter with Jake was a new discovery of pleasures. He knew how to touch me, how to make me feel alive, and that kept me trapped in this vicious cycle. I knew that this double life couldn't go on forever. The lies, the secrets, the constant tension of being discovered. But something in me had already accepted this reality. Maybe I was a horrible person for it. Maybe I deserved all the consequences that would come. "Emily, we need to talk," Peter said one day, with a serious expression. "I feel that something is wrong. You're distant. Different." I knew he was right, but I couldn't admit the truth. "I'm just stressed," I lied, trying to avoid his gaze. "Too many things going on at work." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't insist. I knew I was just putting off the inevitable. And yet I was still seeing Jake, living this life of infidelity. Accepting this reality was both liberating and suffocating. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up, but one thing was certain. The passion for Jake didn't diminish, and the guilt over what I did to Peter was a constant shadow over me. Every day was an internal struggle, a battle between desire and morality. And at the end of the day, I was trapped in a cycle that seemed to have no end. The days went by, and I felt a growing tension between me and Jake, my husband's son. I couldn't understand how we had gotten to this point, but the truth was that something was changing. One night, while everyone was asleep, I went down to the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was silent, and unexpectedly, there was Jake, standing by the fridge. His gaze was intense, the kind of gaze that makes even your hair stand on end. "I couldn't sleep," he said, his voice low. "Neither could I replied, trying not to let my nervousness show. While he was reaching for something in the fridge, our hands accidentally touched. It was a brief touch, but it was charged with electricity. At that moment, something inside me awoke. How did we get to this point? The question echoed in my mind without an answer. A few days later, Jake invited me to his apartment. He said he wanted to talk, that's all. I hesitated, thinking about my marriage to Peter, but eventually accepted. When I got there, the tension was palpable. We sat down on the sofa, and he started talking about how lost he felt, as if he was trapped in a life that wasn't his. Before I knew it, he was closer than he should have been. "Emily, he started, but couldn't finish the sentence. I knew what he meant. Without thinking, I put my hand over his. The touch intensified, and before we knew it, we were kissing. The guilt mixed with pleasure was almost unbearable. We spent the night together, and when I woke up next to him, regret and desire were mixed in a jumble of feelings. At family gatherings, we avoided looking at each other directly, but the sexual tension was undeniable. We talked in silence, with complicit glances, while secretly exchanging ardent text messages. With each furtive encounter, the attraction only grew. Trying to maintain normality at home with Peter was a challenge. I made up excuses to meet Jake, but the guilt consumed me. Looking into Peter's eyes became increasingly difficult. Fantasies about Jake kept me awake at night, and I couldn't stop thinking about him. Once, Jake suggested we spend a weekend together, away from the city. I made up a lie about a business trip, and we left. In the hotel room, unbridled passion enveloped us, and the feeling of freedom and the adrenaline of risk was intoxicating. However, returning to reality was complicated. Pretending to be normal at home became impossible, especially as Peter began to suspect my behavior. Jake was pushing for more dates, and the internal struggle between desire and guilt was consuming me. Our sexual adventures became more and more daring. Meeting in public places increased the fear of being discovered, but also the excitement. I discovered new pleasures and repressed desires, living an exciting and dangerous double life. Over time, I began to get frustrated when I realized that I couldn't stop. The constant lies to Peter made me feel like a traitor, and I no longer knew how I felt about Jake and Peter. The fear of being found out and the consequences haunted me. Jake, impatient, demanded that I choose between him and Peter. I was undecided, afraid of losing everything. The arguments became more heated, but the encounters remained passionate. I decided to continue with Jake, even though I knew the risks. We planned one last date before deciding our future. The tension and passion during our secret meeting was palpable. Whispered promises and ardent kisses gave us the feeling that something was about to change. The signs of my behavior began to weigh on Peter. He quietly investigated, collecting clues that led him to Jake. The tension at home grew, and my fear of being found out grew every day. Until, one evening, Peter confronted me about his suspicions. I tried to deny everything, but the truth came out. The explosion of emotions was overwhelming. Jake was shocked to realize that everything was about to collapse. I looked at Peter, feeling the guilt and pain of having destroyed our life together. The beginning of my affair with Jake was a whirlwind of emotions. Jake, my husband's son, had always been close, but something had changed between us. The tension between us grew by the day, and I didn't know how to deal with it. We were at home on a quiet evening when we found ourselves in the kitchen. "Hi, Emily," he said, with a look I'd never seen before. "Hi, Jake," I replied, trying to stay calm. That's when it happened. An accidental touch. Our gazes met, and I felt a spark. How did we get to this point? The question echoed in my mind. A few days later, Jake invited me to his apartment for a chance meeting. I hesitated. My marriage to Peter was still important to me, but the attraction to Jake was undeniable. I decided to go. When I arrived at Jake's apartment, he welcomed me with a smile that disarmed me. "Emily, I'm glad you came," he said, coming closer. "I shouldn't be here," I mumbled, but I couldn't resist the warmth of his touch. The kiss he gave me sealed the betrayal. That first night was a mixture of guilt and pleasure. We spent the night together, and when I woke up next to him, I felt regret and desire at the same time. "How are you?" he asked, with a worried look on his face. "Confused," I replied. At family gatherings, silent conversations and complicit glances became routine. The sexual tension between us grew with each furtive encounter. The text messages we exchanged were ardent and secret, increasing my desire for him even more. I tried to keep things normal at home with Peter, but it was difficult. I would make up excuses to meet Jake, and guilt would consume me when I looked into Peter's eyes. Fantasies about Jake kept me awake at night. "Emily, are you all right?" Peter asked one night, worried. "Yeah, I'm just tired," I lied, trying to hide the truth. The double life I was leading was exhausting, but the passion for Jake was uncontrollable. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I couldn't stop. The tension between Jake and me began to grow almost unbearably. He was my husband Peter's son, but there was something in his eyes that took my breath away. One quiet evening, while I was getting a glass of water in the kitchen, Jake burst in. Our gazes met, and for a moment, the world stopped. The accidental touch of his hand on mine was the trigger. How did we get to this point? I asked myself. A few days later, Jake invited me to his apartment. I hesitated. I was married to Peter, a good and caring man. But the warmth of Jake's touch and the kiss he gave me were enough to seal the betrayal. Feelings of guilt and pleasure mingled as we spent the night together. I woke up next to Jake, a mixture of regret and desire consuming me. During family gatherings, we exchanged complicit glances and talked quietly. The sexual tension grew with each furtive encounter as we exchanged passionate text messages, always in secret. At home, I tried to keep things normal with Peter. I made up excuses to meet Jake, but guilt consumed me as I looked my husband in the eye. Even so, it was impossible not to fantasize about Jake. Endless nights. Jake planned a weekend away from the city. I lied to Peter, saying it was a business trip. In the hotel room, the passion was unbridled. The feeling of freedom and the adrenaline of risk were intoxicating. When I returned home, pretending to be normal was a difficult task. Peter began to suspect my behavior. Jake pushed for more dates, and I struggled internally between desire and guilt. Our sexual adventures became more and more daring. We met in public places, always with the fear of being discovered. I discovered new pleasures and repressed desires, living an exciting and dangerous double life. Frustrated, I realized I couldn't stop. I was constantly lying to Peter, feeling like a traitor. My feelings for Jake and Peter were confused, and the fear of being found out haunted me. Jake gave me an ultimatum. Either I stayed with him or with Peter. I was undecided, afraid of losing everything. The arguments were heated, but the encounters were still passionate. I decided to continue with Jake, even though I knew the risks. We planned one last date before deciding our future. The tension and passion during the secret meeting were palpable. We promised each other, between ardent kisses, that something would change. Peter became increasingly suspicious. He noticed signs of my behavior, and his suspicion grew. Quietly, he investigated and found clues that led him to Jake. The tension at home was growing, and I feared being found out. The moment came. Peter confronted me about his suspicions. I tried to deny it, but the truth was revealed. Emotions exploded, and Jake, shocked, realized that everything was about to collapse. I was trapped in an impossible situation. Forced to choose between Jake and Peter, I struggled internally. Intense conversations with both of them left me with no way out. I met Jake for the last time before making a decision. Passion and sadness mixed in their last kiss. Jake promised to wait for me. The parting was painful, a sense of permanent loss. I confronted Peter with the truth. His reaction was a storm of emotions. I tried to save our marriage, but the decision to forgive or not was in his hands. My life after the truth was revealed was a whirlwind. The consequences of my actions weighed heavily on me. The relationship with Jake and Peter was shaken, and I wondered about the future, feeling regret. I decided to stay with Jake, despite everything. The secret meetings and the passion didn't die. We were living a double life, trapped in a vicious cycle. Guilt consumed me as I looked at Peter. Continuous lies and the feeling of betrayal tormented me. I doubted my true love, struggling between desire and morality. The encounters with Jake were intense. We discovered new pleasures and desires. The feeling of freedom and adrenaline made me believe that I wouldn't be able to stop, but the truth was revealed. Emotions exploded and Jake, shocked, realized that everything was about to collapse. I was trapped in an impossible situation. Forced to choose between Jake and Peter, I struggled internally. Intense conversations with both of them left me with no way out. I met Jake for the last time before making a decision. Passion and sadness mixed in their last kiss. Jake promised to wait for me. The parting was painful, a sense of permanent loss. I confronted Peter with the truth. His reaction was a storm of emotions. I tried to save our marriage, but the decision to forgive or not was in his hands. My life after the truth was revealed was a whirlwind. The consequences of my actions weighed heavily on me. The relationship with Jake and Peter was shaken, and I wondered about the future, feeling regret. I decided to stay with Jake, despite everything. The secret meetings and the passion didn't die. We were living a double life, trapped in a vicious cycle. Guilt consumed me as I looked at Peter. Continuous lies and the feeling of betrayal tormented me. I doubted my true love, struggling between desire and morality. The encounters with Jake were intense. We discovered new pleasures and desires. The feeling of freedom and adrenaline made me believe that I wouldn't be able to stop. My routine was full of lies and secrets. The tension of being discovered was constant. I reflected on my choices and the consequences of accepting a life of infidelity. Everything was quiet that night, and I couldn't take my eyes off the clock. It was almost 2 a.m, and I was still awake, lost in thought. I got out of bed, trying not to wake Peter, and went to the kitchen in search of a glass of water. It was there, in that silence interrupted only by the noise of the fridge, that I bumped into Jake. He was leaning against the worktop, also awake, with a pensive look on his face. "What are you doing here at this hour?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but feeling a tension in the air that I couldn't explain. "I couldn't sleep," he replied, his intense eyes staring at me in a way that made me shudder. Our gazes met for a moment that seemed like an eternity. I felt my heart race as he reached for a glass in the cupboard, and our fingers accidentally touched. It was a brief touch, but charged with something I didn't want to admit, not even to myself. That night, back in bed, the question on my mind was, how did we get to this point? A few days later, Jake invited me to his apartment for coffee. I was reluctant, remembering Peter and what that could mean. But curiosity and the desire to understand what was happening between us spoke louder. I agreed. When we got there, the atmosphere was charged with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. We sat on the sofa, and the conversation began casually, but soon, the tension became palpable. When Jake touched my hand, I felt a warmth rise through my body, and before I could think, our lips met. The kiss was intense, and at that moment, the betrayal was complete. We spent the night together, guilt mixed with pleasure, in a way I had never experienced before. The next morning, I woke up next to Jake, a whirlwind of emotions inside me. Regret and desire intertwined as I tried to understand what I had done. During family gatherings, our silent conversations and complicit glances only increased the sexual tension between us. We exchanged passionate messages in secret, and each furtive encounter made the situation even more complicated. At home, I tried to keep things normal with Peter. I made up excuses to meet Jake, lies that ate me up inside. Looking into Peter's eyes became increasingly difficult, and at night, fantasies about Jake kept me awake, torturing me with the duality of my feelings. Jake then suggested a weekend away from the city. The idea was tempting, and I lied to Peter, saying it was a business trip. In the hotel room, the unbridled passion made me feel a freedom and an adrenaline rush that I hadn't experienced for a long time. But when I returned home, pretending to be normal became increasingly difficult. Peter began to notice my strange behavior, and his initial suspicions made me panic. Jake pushed for more dates, and I found myself torn between desire and guilt. Our encounters became more and more daring, and the fear of being discovered only added to the excitement. We explored new pleasures, repressed desires that I didn't even know I had. Living this double life was both exciting and dangerous, and I couldn't stop. Frustration grew inside me. The lies to Peter piled up, and I felt more and more like a traitor. I no longer knew how I felt about Jake or Peter, and the fear of being found out tormented me. The consequences of this betrayal were always on my mind, but I kept going, unable to stop. And then, one day, Peter confronted me. "Emily, what's going on?" he asked, his gaze full of suspicion. I tried to deny it, but the truth was written all over my face. The explosion of emotions that followed was devastating. Jake, realizing that everything was about to collapse, was also in shock. I was now faced with an impossible choice. Jake was demanding that I decide between him and Peter. I was undecided, afraid of losing everything. The heated arguments and passionate encounters only added to the tension. I decided to continue with Jake, even though I knew the risks. We planned one last date before deciding our future. The passion and tension during that secret meeting were palpable. The whispered promises and ardent kisses made me feel that something was about to change. Peter became increasingly suspicious of my behavior. He began to notice the signs, and his suspicion grew. He investigated quietly, and the clues led him to Jake. The tension at home was unbearable, and I lived in constant fear of being found out. Finally, Peter confronted me again. "Emily, I need to know the truth," he said, his voice broken. I tried to deny it, but the truth eventually came out. The explosion of emotions was overwhelming. Jake, realizing that everything was falling apart, was in shock. Now, I had to make a difficult choice. Peter or Jake? The internal struggle and anguish of losing one of the two was unbearable. We talked intensely, and I felt trapped in a situation with no way out. Before making a decision, I had one last meeting with Jake. Passion and sadness were mixed in our last kiss. "I'll wait for you," Jake promised. The goodbye was painful, and the sense of loss was overwhelming. Finally, I confronted Peter with the truth. His reaction was a storm of emotions. I tried to save our marriage, but the decision to forgive or not was in his hands. After the truth was revealed, my life was transformed. The consequences of my actions were inevitable, and I reflected on my choices. My relationship with Jake and Peter changed, and I lived with doubt about the future and a sense of regret. The tension between Jake and me began to grow in a way that I couldn't control. Jake, my husband's son, had always been a polite young man, but lately, there was something different about the look in his eyes. One night, while everyone was asleep, I went down to the kitchen to get a drink of water. There was Jake, standing in front of the open fridge. "Hi, I couldn't sleep," he said, his voice soft and low. "Me too," I replied, trying to ignore the chill that ran down my spine when our gazes met. It was at that moment that it all began. An intense gaze, an accidental touch when our hands met as we reached for the same bottle of water. I felt a warmth rise through my body. The question, "How did we get to this point?" echoed in my mind. I couldn't help it. It was beyond my control. A few days later, Jake invited me to his apartment for a chance meeting. I hesitated, remembering Peter, my husband, and the commitment we had. But the tension between Jake and me was undeniable. When I arrived at his apartment, the warmth of Jake's touch and the kiss that sealed our betrayal took me by surprise. Guilt mixed with pleasure as we spent the night together. I knew I was cheating on Peter, but I couldn't stop. Waking up next to Jake the next morning was a mixture of regret and desire. We didn't exchange many words, but our looks said it all. At family gatherings, the silent conversations and the complicit glances increased the sexual tension between us. We started exchanging passionate text messages in secret. Every furtive encounter was an explosion of emotions. At home, I tried to keep things normal with Peter. I made up excuses to meet Jake, but guilt consumed me when I looked into Peter's eyes. At night, fantasies about Jake kept me awake. I was living a double life, and I was sinking deeper and deeper into the abyss. Jake planned a weekend away from the city. I lied to Peter, saying it was a business trip. In the hotel room, the unbridled passion between Jake and me was intense. I felt a freedom I had never experienced before, and the adrenaline of the risk made me euphoric. When I returned home, pretending to be normal became more difficult. Peter became suspicious of my behavior. Jake was pushing for more dates, and I was struggling between desire and guilt. Sexual adventures with Jake became more and more daring. Encounters in public places increased the fear of being discovered, but also the excitement. I couldn't stop. The constant lies to Peter made me feel like a traitor. More and more, I doubted my feelings for Jake and Peter. The fear of being found out, and the consequences haunted me. Jake demanded that I choose between him and Peter. I was undecided, afraid of losing everything. The arguments with Jake were intense, but the encounters were even more passionate. I decided to continue with Jake, even though I knew the risks. We planned one last date before deciding the future. The tension and passion during our secret meeting was palpable. Whispered promises and ardent kisses made me feel that something was about to change. Peter became increasingly suspicious. He began to notice signs and quietly investigate. The tension at home was unbearable, and I feared being discovered at any moment. Finally, Peter confronted me about his suspicions. I denied everything, but the truth soon came out. The explosion of emotions was overwhelming. Jake, realizing that everything was about to collapse, was in shock. I was trapped in an impossible dilemma. Forced to choose between Jake and Peter, the anguish of losing one of the two consumed me. The intense conversations with both of them made it clear that I was at a dead end. I met Jake one last time before making a decision. Passion and sadness mixed in their last kiss. Jake promised to wait for me, and the goodbye was painful. When I confronted Peter with the truth, his reaction was a storm of emotions. I was trying to save our marriage, but the decision to forgive or not was in his hands. Now, after everything, my life is shrouded in uncertainty. The consequences of my actions make me reflect on my choices. My relationship with Jake and Peter has changed forever. The future is uncertain, and the feeling of regret is constant.